From the right, I'm Matt Lewis.
From the left, I'm Bill Scher.
And you're watching
The Week in Blog.
On this week's episode, President Obama gets a Nobel Prize. We're going to talk healthcare and Climategate. But first, Bill, President Obama got a Nobel Prize, and Michelle Malkin wrote, in honor of President Barack Obama's acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize, I think we should declare today Happy National Post-Achievement Day. What award or honor don't you deserve? Claim it. What unearned prize for unmet aspirations would you like to give yourself? Declare it. What, Bill Scher, award would you like to claim today? Father of the Year
so
award,
I take it
perhaps.
Michelle is not one of these conservatives that is praising Obama's speech, of which there seem to be several.
Well, I think there's a difference between praising his speech and praising the fact that he got the award.
Those are different things. It was interesting how the committee themselves handled it and how the president himself handled it. The introductory speech for him essentially was a long analysis of a sloppy baby transfer just there. An analysis of past Nobel Prize winners, and the Nobel Committee chair basically saying it's not like every person who's ever given it to had these perfect concrete accomplishments, because the challenge of establishing peace is always very hard fought, long roads, one obstacle after another. Nelson Mandela wasn't given the Peace Prize after he defeated apartheid, for example. It was one example that was given. Woodrow Wilson didn't get it after the League of Nations was formed, which never got off the ground. It wasn't until decades later that you had the United Nations. So they put Obama's speech in that context, and also taking off things that they felt were substantive accomplishments, even in such an early stage of his presidency. And Obama himself, of course, has been very humble in accepting the award and saying others that deserve it most certainly far more work left to be done. So I do kind of get the sense that for Michelle and others to kind of harp on that, it just seems very oddly political, instead of just sort of being happy that an American president's got an honor like that and understanding the context in which it was given in. It seems sort of like this sort of strange sour grapes. I don't know if flies very well.
Well, you might not be surprised for me to disagree with you, but I think it's been universal. The fact that he got it's been pretty universally panned. It's not just a conservative phenomenon. I mean, clearly, at best, it's premature. Frankly, I think that, I tweeted this out today, Jethro Tull had a better argument that they deserved a Grammy in the heavy metal category than did President Obama for the Peace Prize. It is way too early. And look, there is a political dynamic. I mean, Ronald Reagan, the man who ended the Cold War, I don't think he got a Nobel Prize. And yet, he did a lot more, you could argue, to bring about peace than President Obama has done so far. And I think a lot of people on the left, that I'm reading at least, are thinking this is really hypocritical in the sense that he just committed 30,000 troops to Afghanistan.
Well, but this is the aspect of the speech. He actually spent a lot of time with the speech, talking about Afghanistan and the role of the necessity of force at times, even when peace is your ultimate goal. And of course, that is an aspect of the speech that was getting a lot of conservative praise. You had competing posts at Powerline. You had Scott. Are they going by their weirdo nicknames anymore? Are they still Hind Rocket and Super Elephant and stuff like that? Or are they just the regular names now?
I've never gotten into the aliases or pen names.
But Scott, was sort of traditionally mocking. He talks about the law of love and declares his belief that the human condition can be perfected. The nonviolence practiced by Gandhi and King was always the North Star that guides us on our journey. While it's not as bad as it could have been, its many strands deserve additional attention. It's a deeply dispiriting speech. Then you had his cohort, Paul, calling the speech a pleasant surprise.
I think it could be both, actually.
Fundamentally, I think Obama delivered a mostly thoughtful discussion of how to reconcile our lofty ideals with the existence of evil and how to reconcile the occasional need to go to war. including at times for humanitarian reasons, with the tragic nature of any actual war. And those sorts of responses got a bit of a reprimand from Adam Scher at the Prospect blog, Tapped, saying, the conservatives are treated like it's some sort of revelation that Obama feels this way, but his classic anti-Iraq war speech from back in 2002, which he based a whole lot of his presidential campaign on, said explicitly, "I don't oppose all wars. What I am opposed to is a dumb war, a rash war." So he always was in the context of not being a knee-jerk pacifist in all cases, but looking at things case by case and making the argument in the speech today that Afghanistan is a proper case.
Right. And remember last week, right here on the Weekend Blog, we talked about my disappointment in his Afghanistan speech and how I thought he was missing an opportunity to be the President of the United States, not just the President of the Liberals. And I think he missed, at the Afghanistan speech, he missed that opportunity rhetorically, even though he did deliver 30,000 troops to Afghanistan. I think it was a better speech at the Nobel Prize speech, and I do think that he gave a much better speech, and some of that should have been worked into the Afghanistan primetime speech. Bill Kristol, actually, over at the Washington Post on the blog, compared it to George W. Bush's 2002 State of the Union, I believe. So it's interesting. Now, the idea that Obama has always been a war president, or I would take dispute with that. Now, certainly during the campaign, there were times when he talked tough, and his rhetoric.
Well, he talked about going to Afghanistan during the campaign.
Right, absolutely, and that was what I would call sort of a Kennedy-esque liberalism. Barney Burton, that sort of thing. And traditionally, liberals, it's a fairly modern phenomenon that liberals are essentially doves. Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy. These were liberals, even Franklin Roosevelt, for obvious reasons. Who believed, and back then it was conservatives who were isolationists, who didn't want to get involved, and things have radically changed over the years. So there is a liberal tradition of that. But I think that Obama, at the very best, I will say, has given mixed signals on that. And this is the first time since he became president. This speech, I think, is an important, maybe turning point. This is the first time since he became president where I think he has actually returned to the rhetoric that he ran on in terms of foreign affairs and international relations.
Well, go back to Scher's post at Tapped. He said, if you actually look at the Obama who gave the speech in 2002, today's speech held few surprises in former content. It's not a vindication of conservatism. It's an explicit rejection of torture, of the refusal to engage in hostile regimes. It held praise for international law and institutions as necessary to achieve, as Obama said, quoting President Kennedy, quote, a more practical, more attainable peace, unquote. Sure, some liberals are anti-war in principle, but this president has never been one of them. Certainly, if you bought into the idiotic conservative caricature of him as a radical anti-American traitor, then yes, Obama's defense of war in certain circumstances will come as a surprise. This is one of the more infuriating aspects of conservative discourse. One invents a caricature of one's political opponent, then congratulates oneself for having influence in opponent's thinking when that caricature turns out to be false.
Well, I don't think it's an unfair characterization, though. A lot of times, today Barack Obama sounded like John F. Kennedy. A lot of times he sounds like Jimmy Carter. And there's a big difference between Kennedy and Carter, and between 1960 and really 1972. But in the decade of the 60s, the Democratic Party and the left really changed. And so I think that we almost have a schizophrenic president right now. And today he was the president that ran for office and that sounded Kennedy-esque. And I hope that tomorrow he's not the Mr. Malaise Jimmy Carter president again. But I don't think it's not an unfair caricature when we have liberals like John F. Kerry who threw his medals across the gate at the White House caricatures stick, narratives stick because there's at least an element of truth to them. You don't get a narrative to stick if it's entirely false. At least usually that's not the case.
It's true that John F. Kerry does actually windsurf.
Yes, he does.
That was not made up.
All right. Well, I guess we've beat a dead horse there. Let's move on. What's next, Bill?
Well, one of the bigger domestic developments this week was the announcement of the outlines of a healthcare deal. A gang of 10 of 5 liberal senators and 5 right-leaning Democratic senators. They haven't formally announced what's in the deal, although the outlines of it have been, I think, fairly legitimately leaked out. But the idea is that they have this sort of package of different ideas that they want to get scored by CBO again, with the tacit understanding, I think, from at least those 10 in the room, that if they scored well, they would go forth. And the deal loses the public option as it's been proposed initially by Harry Reid, a newly created government-administered plan that would compete against private plans. It loses that in exchange for an expansion of the private health insurance exchange that federal employees have access to, including Congress people, and an expansion of Medicare so workers between 55 and 64 can buy into that. There's a split on the left in how, in response to that, what's the reaction from the right on that?
I think it's the reaction is one of surprise and of not knowing what to do strategically. Because now you're faced with this situation where, you don't. Do you come out and say that's good because it's not the public option? So I think that conservatives right now are probably getting their footing.
I mean, one question I have is, for a while now, we've seen conservatives. I'm not sure if this is true in the blogosphere. Maybe it is, but certainly the conservative senators saying, don't cut Medicare.
Right.
This deal is going to cut Medicare, and that's bad, which has not been traditionally the conservative position. Having embraced Medicare so strongly in recent weeks, can conservatives turn on a dime and say, hey, wait a second, don't expand Medicare? I mean, it was good, but it's not that good.
Right, and I mean, Philip Klein at the American Spectator, I think it was him today, who made that exact point. Strategically speaking, it was very dangerous for Republicans to do what they did strategically, because then it looks hypocritical. Also of note, I mean, today I just saw that Nancy Pelosi said we'll take almost any deal we can get. So she's willing to maybe push aside the public option, which earlier she said was a deal breaker. And there's even talk, Bill, of a strategy where the House would simply pass the Senate bill as it is without going to conference and get it done by Christmas.
Although I think Pelosi was pushing back on that.
Yeah, she was pushing back on that, but she also said willing to do almost anything to get a deal.
Well, and this resulted in a 128-point headline on the Huffington Post saying "Public Option RIP," which struck me as being too sensationalist. Now, again, there's
that gets page views, Bill, and links and tweets.
And I know the Huffington Post knows about page views.
Yeah, they know what they're doing there. Politico would probably do the same thing.
Now, I think there are legitimate differences of opinion on the left about the nature of this deal. You have folks like Ezra Klein, who have been generally supportive of this, and basically were agitating for something along these lines previously, saying, hey, the public option has been compromised to death as it is. Why don't you exchange it for something better?
Right.
And he thinks expansion for Medicare is something better, which is, I mean, regardless of how you feel about it, Medicare buying into that is a form of public option. It may not be as accessible a form as the past what's in the House bill because it's only people in that age cohort. But the House version wasn't widely accessible to everybody either. These are all various types of compromises.
Right. And by the way, Bill, I think you and I think this is pretty much what we've said all along. Something will pass.
Right.
It will not be what the liberals really want, but they're going to get something. I mean, there's no way that something wouldn't pass. And if this happened, if Medicare was the sort of compromise that ends up going through, which very well could happen at this point in lieu of the public option, it wouldn't surprise me. This would be pretty consistent with what I think we've both been saying all along.
I think so. And I thought it was very notable that Chris Bowers at Open Left had a post yesterday called Making the Case for Compromise, saying, while it looks like we didn't get the new public option program, we've received at least 4 million more people covered by Medicaid, which is a public option, than the July version of the House bill. 1 to 2 million covered by the Medicare buy-in, which is also a public option, entirely absent in the July version of the House bill, and an increase to 90% in the percentage of money private companies must spend on health care from the premiums that they get. These are all concessions directly made to progressives in return for dropping a Medicare plus 5% public option that would have covered 10 million people. Not bad. And Open Left has generally been, not the place you go to for arguments for compromises.
Right.
And so for Bowers to make that case, I thought was very notable.
Yeah. That tells you something. And
now at the same time, Fire Dog Lake is adamantly against the compromise. John Walker, who's been their healthcare guru, saying, wait a second, expanding Medicare might be nice in principle, but there's plenty of devils in the details here. Who's really going to be eligible? What's the premiums going to be? Is this going to be affordable? Ken Conrad's talking about separating it from the rest of Medicare, so it would not be as good a plan as traditional Medicare. So by no means is there liberal consensus on this point, but you're not seeing too much pushback by liberals in the Senate, although with one notable exception, I know Senator Merkley, a freshman senator from Oregon, little skeptical because the rural folks are nervous about expanding Medicare because of reimbursements to rural hospitals. Meryl Guzner, who's a healthcare expert who blogs at Goose News, was saying, hey, you can buy off rural politicians with some extra reimbursements. That's a doable deal. That may be what Merkley is trying to accomplish.
Well, so assuming that were to happen, it will be interesting how this will play politically. I think that if liberals passed a public option, it would hurt them in off-year elections. And if they failed to pass any bill, it would certainly hurt them in off-year elections. But what happens if they pass a compromise? Does that hurt them politically? And right now, Philip Klein at American Spectator wrote today that the Democrats' health care legislation is now polling worse than President Bush's failed efforts to reform Social Security in 2005. Right now, 61% of Americans are against it, 36% are for it. Comparably, in 2005, 52% of Americans were against the Social Security reform and 44% were for it. But what do you think, Bill? I mean, is this sort of threading that needle? If they pass a compromise, does that also help them politically in the off-year elections?
Well, there have been blog posts this week by Mark Blumenthal at Pollster and Jonathan Chait at the New Republic, and this is actually a point, if I may pat myself on the back, that I've made in our Future.org previously. If you break down the polling, even the recent polls, not all critics of the health care bill are the same. There are conservative critics and there are liberal critics. If you combine the supporters of the bill and the liberal critics of the bill, you get a clear majority. So you have a certain portion of those people saying, I oppose this bill because they don't think it's liberal enough. And I would expect, and even in the polls that you're mentioning there, those polls, when they ask about public option as a standalone, it still has majority support. So,
but it's wait a second though, Bill, because this poll that Phil Klein was referring to, 61% of Americans don't favor the health care legislation.
The bill as generically described.
61-36. So you're telling me that there are enough liberals who don't think the bill's liberal enough to overcome a 61-36 margin.
The poll that I know that Chait and Blumenthal were focusing on was, I believe, a CNN poll, where that oppositional number was more in the 50s, I believe, and not in the 60s.
Okay.
I'm not sure where that particular poll comes from. But potentially, yes. If you have, a good. So what's the support there? 38.
36.
36.
Yeah.
15%. 50 percentage points of liberals being against it, you'd get to 50%. That's not. I believe in the CNN poll that number was more in the low 10s. So it's not a crazy jump to make. So when Bill Clinton spoke at Never
let me say so, Bill. In any event, though, I mean, you could potentially make that same argument about Bush's Social Security reform. I mean, maybe it's not quite the same thing, but it's fair. There might have been potentially there could have been a few percent that didn't think it went far enough. Maybe it's not.
It's possible. You'd have to look at those numbers. Not my recollection of that polling, but numbers are numbers.
Yeah. Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
When Bill Clinton spoke at Netroots Nation, one of the messages he said to the bloggers there, and I believe the same message he told to Congress people when he met with them later on, is that the day you pass the bill, your poll numbers are going to go up. You'll get all these accolades for having done something.
Yeah, well, I mean, there may be something to that. I mean, I think passing the public option outright, passing a robust public option hurts Democrats, and failing to pass anything hurts Democrats. But passing a compromise, maybe it's not so bad for them.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with you that the robust public option would be a political loser, but I will say that a compromise public option, which is pretty much what's always been on the table here, they never got a robust option through anybody at Congress. You're going to have some credible progressive spokespeople, like Howard Dean, like Nancy Pelosi, like Anthony Weiner, who's gotten a lot of street cred recently for being a big single-payer champion, like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has gotten behind Medicare buy-in. When those folks go out there and make a case for it, I'm sure there'll be differences of opinion and other liberals who won't like it. But when you have that number of faces out there saying nice things, it's not going to result in a collapse of the base. And you should also get support from the middle, who might have uneasiness about this or that, but are very frustrated about skyrocketing healthcare costs and feel like, hey, at least these folks are doing something on my behalf.
All right, so we've got coming up next week, right? Copenhagen. You and I were on a conference call today about this.
Yep.
Last week we were criticized roundly by the commenters for not addressing Climategate,
which is, of course, the most important story of a generation.
So I wanted to read to you two things. One, well, let me start off with Hugh Hewitt's comments, HughHewitt.com. It's very funny how the writers on the networks cannot bring themselves to discuss the import of the content of emails independent of the method by which they were obtained. The fury of the Greens in the newsrooms cannot be contained. When the New York Times was busy publishing national security secrets, did the MSM precede every story on the surveillance program with a description indicating that the information had been obtained via a criminal act? Of course not, but the writers approved of that illegal pilfering of information. Unlike the Times' use of wrongfully obtained information, however, Climategate threatens no one's life and no one's national security. And Bill, there's another story this week which plays into this, which is the TSA documents, which were, the TSA had put documents online outlining how they would screen passengers. And it was a blog that figured out that terrorists could have accessed this information, and they leaked that information to the press, potentially saving lives in the future, and they potentially, could get in trouble for doing that. So I think there is one thing to note is that there's sort of a double standard that the people who leaked the Climategate information are in some ways being treated as villains, but the people who leaked TSA information are treated, and security secrets to the New York Times are treated as whistleblowers.
Obviously, I don't think Climategate is an actual scandal, but be that as it may.
How could it not be, Bill? It has gate by its name. Watch out.
The New York Times were the first publications to report on the story. I mean, I don't understand why they're getting flack for somehow burying this. They were one of the first, traditional media publications to cover this thing. I mean,
didn't they also
the Climategate advocates have got an incredible media run. They've gotten plenty of coverage. This has not been a buried story.
All right, so this is the part we talked about this offline a little bit, and this is what I think is interesting. I want to hear your take. You think that conservatives have done a great job of disseminating this information in a way that liberals could not have done. Correct?
Well, I wrote a blog post today about this in part. Not that argument. You and I talked about that personally. I think there's two things I'd say about this. One is a great example that conservative blogger, conservative movement skills in taking what I would call ginned up phony scandals. You may, of course, have a different take on that.
Yes.
Circulating information about that in conservative circles and catapulting it into traditional media. They have not lost their ability to do that even in the age of Obama. And a side part of that I was talking to you about previously, the thread that we had on last week's The Week in Blog post, even though we didn't even talk about Climategate last week.
That was our mistake.
It almost was like all the rank and file soldiers in the conservative movement, without there being, a formal call to arms, just all sort of knew we're going to flood the internet and every nook and cranny, every blog, every newspaper website.
Where have they been? I'd like to know, where have they been? These people who were commenting, where have they been since I've been doing this? I don't remember seeing any commenters from the conservative side, or very rarely at Blogging Heads. Let's be frank about it. So you think that this was an orchestrated attempt? See, I would argue that it's actually organic. That this is an issue that, for whatever reason, ignites passions. And I also think, if you look at the emails, Bill, I got to tell you, can you delete any emails you may have had with Keith? Keith will do likewise. He's not in at the moment. Minor family crisis. Can you also email Gene and get him to do the same? I don't have his new email address. And, the fact is we can't account for the lack of warming at the moment, and it's a travesty that we can't. There should be more warming, but the data are surely wrong. Our observing system is inadequate. That's sexy stuff. It's basically an admission of guilt, and it's somebody said, I think, in National Review that it came close to being the Monica Lewinsky's blue dress.
Well, there are great investigative pieces at Popular Mechanics and Columbia Journalism Review, among others, that talk about how many of those quotes are completely stripped of their actual context and don't say the types of the things that conservatives are trying to make them say. Now, they may have done some ethical things in trying to pressure people who disagree with their studies, and maybe in ways they handled their raw data and that's being reviewed, but there's nothing that indicates that the peer-reviewed science is at all in question. And that goes to the second part of what I blogged about myself at ourfuture.org today, is that even though conservatives have had this fantastic media run with it, they actually have not had any tangible political success. There is not a single senator that is saying, I'm not going to vote for a carbon cap bill now, and I might have before because now it's been proven that climate change is a hoax. There's not a single country in Copenhagen that is backing away from a deal because of climate change. The conference call you and I were on.
That's because this is a religion.
Journal.
This is a religion, and you would have to shake the faith of somebody pretty strong to get them to abandon their religion, Bill. But look, I think that this may be a crack in the armor, but the problem is that, look, I'm not a scientist, you're not a scientist. But I think that part of the argument that these folks have had all along has been, trust us. We're the scientists. We know best. And there's general consensus among scientists, although there are numerous scientists.
Trust the fact that there is something called peer review, which ferrets out any kinds of cutting of corners and sloppy work or whatever that might have come up in some informal email exchanges, but all that stuff gets squeezed out and refined through a peer review process. That's what people are saying deserves trust, which is saved humanity, arguably, for generations.
Can you delete any emails you may have had? Keith will do likewise. Can you also email Gene and have him do this? This is very, very bad, Bill. So, anyway.
One thing I also point folks to of note, Wonk Room did a very... I mean, the one thing we don't actually know, by the way, is who stole the email addresses? Who did the hacking? No one quite knows.
Yeah.
And how this actually fared out through the conservative blogosphere is a little unclear, but Wonk Room did, I think, the best investigation we can as far as tracking, how it went from site to site to site. Largely the emails initially showed up on a climate skeptic website called AirVent, and that jumped to a skeptical blog called What's Up With That. But who did the actual hacking, we don't know. And there's a British newspaper, The Independent, actually pointing the finger at former KGB, but that's not definitively proven yet.
And this is a whole other topic, which I think we can reserve for another talk show, but just the sense that all this stuff that's going on, I mean, Joe the plumber had his information illegally accessed through Ohio public servants. Sarah Palin had her email address hacked into by some college student. We mentioned the TSA thing, which was probably a public service and probably a whistleblower thing. We mentioned the leaking of documents of the New York Times. Very interesting how this stuff's coming out. Are these people heroes and whistleblowers, or are they criminals and villains and potentially KGB agents?
Well, I mean, it's a fine. I mean, you can be a criminal and be a hero at the same time. It is possible.
That's going to be the epitaph for you right there.
I mean, but you can be. I mean, most whistleblowers are technical lawbreakers, but are doing it with honest, legitimate motives, and that it's a subjective call whether you are on the side of right or side of wrong. Even though it's not a subjective call whether or not you're breaking the law,
right?
And if you're
the Abu Ghraib photos, right? I mean, I think somebody leaked that, right? I don't recall how that story broke, but
it was probably fed to I think it was fed to CBS and to the New Yorker, if I recall. I don't know if there was a law broken in the doing of that. I don't recall.
Yeah. Well, and then the other thing is, I mean, you and I, as writers, as bloggers, we maybe not from illegal information, but we certainly, our lifeblood is people giving us information that other people would probably prefer they not give us.
Right, and in some cases that's a law violation, in some cases it's not. I mean, as far as how you deal with folks like that, I think that's one of the aspects of the justice system is that a judge or a jury can take into account mitigating circumstances when meting out a sentence. Not that you shouldn't say you are now not guilty because you had good motives, but maybe you'd have a lighter sentence if it was understood that you were seeing criminal violations going on and you had to break a technical law to get the word out. In the case of hacking into these email addresses, I would not argue these folks are on the side of right and justice. But obviously other folks would disagree.
Well, is that a good place to end it, Bill? Or
well, just one other point about Copenhagen itself. One of the arguments that I've made is that Climategate has not really knocked the Copenhagen summit off track. There's still very optimistic expectations that they're going to come to a political agreement, but you have some dispute on the left, how good that agreement will be. Bill McKibben, who heads up 350.org, a leading organization, saying that what's potentially coming out of Copenhagen, potentially coming out of the U.S. Senate, is not going to have strong enough targets to avert a climate crisis. Has a post up at Mother Jones called "Skunks at Copenhagen's Garden Party," accusing the developed nations there, including the U.S., of trying to have a PR victory and not a substantive victory. Whereas you have on Climate Progress a post from some of the Center for American Progress climate fellows saying that myth versus reality on Copenhagen Climate Summit, saying that's a myth, that they're not going to do anything substantive there. It won't be just a a limp political deal. This is the first of a two-step process that's actually going to have some tangible results immediately and lead to an even more binding agreement next year. So there's dispute on the left how meaningful this is. I'm on the side of the optimists myself, and I think the fact that
Bill,
Obama is going to go...
Am I correct? Because they're all using different metrics, and what I'm hearing is that the deal that China and India are trying to get would actually allow them to increase their emissions.
Well, their initial bids would do that. It's true, and this is a frustration, I think, in general, that every nation is using a different metric in their bid. The idea of having a binding treaty, of course, is to have a consistent metric that everyone's got to follow. Maybe you'd have sliding scales to different countries, but we'd all be working off the same sheet. What China and India have talked about is reducing their level of emissions relative to their GDP growth, but they're both expected to have enormous GDP growth in the next several years. So you can sort of say, sure, you're doing good relative to your growth, but the atmosphere doesn't really give a crap about that. We got to be able to maintain a certain concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere to avert a crisis, and if you're not doing your part, we're not going to get there. But the fact that China and India are making bids at all is new. And one of the things that is hoped for here, I mean, it's all a series of baby steps. And if it can be made clear that China and India are at least moving, are at least doing something to mitigate their carbon, that might will be enough of a basis for a preliminary agreement. And then when Obama goes back to Washington, Senators Kerry and Senators Lieberman and Senators Graham, the tripartisan trio that just released their new framework for compromise today, they want to be able to lean on those senators on the fence and say, hey, look, you can't use China and India as an excuse anymore. They are moving. Maybe not as fast as we would like right now, but they are moving, and they'll move even faster if we get our bill passed too. So it's all a question of little baby trust building steps, and we'll see if we can get China and India to move even more between now and the end of the summit. The fact that Obama is going, initially he was going to go at the front end of the summit, and he called a little flack for that, saying that was going to be a drive-by. Now he changed his schedule and is going at the end of the summit for the final negotiations, which is a much bigger chunk of prestige being put on the line. So if they don't get a decent agreement, it will clearly be put on his shoulders for coming up short. And presumably he wouldn't make that trip without a pretty good sense of what China and India were going to do. He met with both of those leaders, in the past several weeks. Presumably he got a good sense of what they were going to do and felt comfortable with the direction they're headed in.
All I know is that you mentioned baby steps a lot, and I'm thinking about what about Bob? Every time you say baby steps, I'm thinking of a classic movie, frankly, that probably does not get the attention it deserves.
Not my favorite in the Bill Murray canon, I might say.
I mean, it's no Groundhog Day.
Exactly. Groundhog Day is a tour de force.
I'm also a big Rushmore fan.
Rushmore also?
Have you seen the movie Rushmore, Wes Anderson?
I'd say that's my favorite Wes Anderson.
It's my favorite, too. It's the most optimistic. They're all kooky or offbeat, but, some of the others have, I would say, a more cynical outlook of human nature. But I think that Rushmore is a more positive view. And that kid, the kid who plays Max Fisher is Talia Shire's son.
Right, Coppola.
Yes, and he has a rock band that's pretty good. I actually have one of their CDs. I don't remember the name of them right now. But they have a good song called Night Timing that I think you should check out.
Once again, Matt, you have out-hipstered me.
Yes, I got it in right at the buzzer. All right, man. Very, very good not seeing you again.
So I'll be gone for a few weeks for holiday break.
Yes.
I hope you can survive.
Yes, I will get by. And I guess that means we're not going to have a very special Christmas episode.
Not you and me.
Because I wanted to do... Remember last time we talked about the celebrities we met that were nice, that we liked?
Those are good times.
I want to talk about the people who were real jerks to me and pay them back, but I guess that's going to have to wait.
That's more of a very special Festivus episode.
That's a Festivus. Exactly. All right. Have a good one and have a great Christmas, holiday, Festivus.
vacation,
and we'll see you in the new year.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
That's right.
Wow. All right. Have a good one, man.
You too. Take care.